On one side, people chant Skyrim belongs to the Nords, believing in the cause of Ulfric Stormcloak and his followers. On the other, many side with the Legion, convinced that only the Empire can stand against the Thalmor. As people of the same blood spill each other's across the frozen lands of Skyrim, the sudden return of the ancient dragon Alduin, the World Eater of legend, throws the already chaotic civil war into even deeper turmoil. But many players overlook the group most affected by this tangled conflict: the people of Skyrim. The Skyrim Civil War, which erupted in the 201st year of the Fourth Era, is far more than a struggle for a throne or a simple territorial dispute. It represents a turning point where imperial authority is crumbling, Nord culture is being suppressed, and the geopolitical future of Tamriel hangs in the balance. And yet, it's the local citizens and immigrants of Skyrim who bear the true weight of this war. The conflict has sunk so deeply into daily life that neighbors who've lived side by side for decades are now ready to draw blood. Meanwhile, Skyrim, with its frozen lands and barren soil, still needs to feed its people, trade goods, and keep its economy alive. With unsafe trade routes, rebels lurking in the wilds, political games for power, and children left orphaned by war, the landscape of the Civil War becomes heartbreakingly grim. Welcome to the 5th episode of the Skyrim Civil War series. So far, we've explored the motivations of the war's main figures and tried to understand them through a more philosophical lens. In earlier videos, when we talked about Ulfric or Balgruf, I briefly mentioned how the people of Skyrim have been affected by the war. But this time, we're turning the camera entirely toward them, the ordinary folk, and focusing on how this war impacts those without great titles or power. Let me say it up front. This video won't be about mysterious lore details or clickbait topics. My goal here is to show the destruction and senselessness that come with war itself. As you know, I've often said I'm a firm supporter of the Stormcloaks. Yet, despite my love for the idea of freedom, even I can see that the Skyrim Civil War is, at its core, a meaningless struggle. I'm sure many of you have also thought that the conflict between the Empire and the Stormcloaks could have been resolved without bloodshed. But now, families are torn apart, and too much blood has been spilled. This video is a story about how a war, born from the ambitions and mistakes of those in power, flows through the veins of ordinary people. Before we begin, if you'd like to support me, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on everything we discuss down in the comments. There are many people deeply affected by the Civil War, but to keep this video from running too long, I had to focus on just a few of them. Maybe I'll talk about the others in a future episode. So, if there's a character whose story I didn't mention here but who was affected by the Civil War, please share it with me. Enjoy the video. Before we talk about how the war affected the people, I think it's worth briefly explaining what the Skyrim Civil War actually is, especially for those who might not be too familiar with Elder Scrolls lore. If you'd like a more detailed breakdown, you can check out the earlier episodes of this series. The roots of the Civil War trace back to the White Gold Concordat, the treaty that ended the Great War in the 175th year of the Fourth Era. This agreement, forced upon the Empire by the Aldmeri Dominion and its ruling body, the Thalmor, came with harsh and humiliating terms. Among them, one condition in particular struck at the very heart of both Nord culture and the Empire's spiritual legitimacy. That clause, as most of us know, was the ban on worshipping Talos, the god most revered by the Nords, founder of the Septim Empire, the only mortal to conquer all of Tamriel, and the god-king who once walked the world as Tiber Septim. Although his exact origins remain uncertain, many Nords believe that Talos himself was one of their own. Because of that, his importance in Skyrim is far greater than in any other province of Tamriel. The ban on Talos worship didn't just strip the Nords of their religious freedom, it also deeply undermined the Empire's spiritual authority and legitimacy. After all, Talos symbolizes the divine approval of the Empire's official pantheon, the Nine Divines. By disrespecting both its founder and one of its gods, the Empire dealt a heavy blow to its own image, even among its loyal provinces. In the wake of this betrayal, rebellious Nord figures like Ulfric Stormcloak saw the decree as an attack on their faith and identity. What began as outrage soon grew into a movement, and eventually a full-blown rebellion that engulfed all of Skyrim. The White Gold Concordat also granted Thalmor agents the authority to operate freely within Imperial territory, a clear sign that the Empire had compromised its own sovereignty. You can see the effects of this in places like Northwatch Keep, where Thalmor agents maintain a strong presence. Of course, we know the Empire agreed to these terms partly to buy time, to recover and prepare for a second war against the Aldmeri Dominion. But to the people of Skyrim, these concessions looked like nothing but weakness and betrayal. It's also worth mentioning that Northwatch Keep is believed to be a place where Nords who worship Talos are imprisoned and tortured. In fact, as you'll see in Whiterun, some residents mention that their family members were captured by the Thalmor and taken there. So while the Civil War rages on the surface, these kinds of horrors are happening quietly behind the scenes. Now, let's talk a bit about the ideological framework of the Civil War. The conflict is essentially defined by two opposing ideologies. The Stormcloak movement represents a nationalist, separatist cause, one that demands the freedom to openly worship Talos and seeks to reclaim control of the Nords' ancestral homeland. While this movement may appear justified at first, it has faced strong criticism, especially after Ulfric Stormcloak killed High King Torrig and showed clear signs of racial prejudice toward the Argonians and Dunmer. On the other side stands the Empire, the same one we've always served under throughout the Elder Scrolls series. What's left of it is now a form of pragmatic imperialism, holding Tamriel together in the hope of resisting the growing power of the Aldmeri Dominion. Many players believe that a united empire offers the best chance of survival against the Thalmor. From their perspective, an independent Skyrim and a weakened empire would stand no chance against such a threat. Still, that belief isn't without criticism either, especially considering the Empire's corruption and the defiance of provinces like Hammerfell. In many ways, this entire story reflects the timeless tension between nationalism and imperialism on a philosophical and political level. The nationalism embraced by the Stormcloak movement emphasizes the identity, culture, and interests of a single nation, seeking independence or autonomy from a larger power. In real-world history, we've seen similar nationalist movements rise throughout the 1900s, and just like in our world, Skyrim's own wave of nationalism emerged as a reaction to a weakened, corrupt empire, one that had begun to ignore the cultural values it was meant to protect. Within the scope of this video, I don't think it really matters who's right or wrong. I've already talked in previous episodes about why each side might believe they're justified, and I've shared my own opinions too. But trying to draw a final conclusion here would miss the point. What matters for now is understanding how the war started and how it developed. So, let's take a look at what this war has actually cost the lands of Skyrim. The Skyrim Civil War has two major direct impacts on ordinary people. First, the collapse of economic and logistical systems, and second, the loss of countless lives. This conflict has shattered production, trade, and civilian stability, causing destruction not only on the battlefield but also in everyday life. Let's focus now on the economic and logistical damage left behind. There are plenty of clear signs that Skyrim's civil order has fallen apart. The chaos of war has led to a dramatic rise in banditry, something we can witness firsthand as we travel across Skyrim. Some even suggest that despite the game's population balance, there are actually more bandits than civilians in Skyrim, many of whom turn to crime simply because of war or a lack of opportunity. It's an absurd situation that shows just how deeply the province's social order has collapsed, with no real recovery in sight. Even during the Oblivion Crisis, Cyrodiil didn't suffer from this level of lawlessness. This breakdown is directly linked to the weakening of central authority. Both the Empire and the Stormcloaks have conscripted local guards and manpower through the Jarls, pulling them away from their towns and villages to fight on the front lines. With guards gone, trade routes outside the cities became vulnerable, creating perfect conditions for bandits and pirates to thrive across Skyrim. We know, for example, that pirates threatened the ships of the East Empire Company operating out of Solitude's port, and during one questline we even witnessed Khajiit caravans struggling against two different groups of bandits. Of course, this situation didn't just hurt the civilian economy, it also created a vicious feedback loop. As security declined, trade between cities slowed or stopped entirely, leading to food shortages and rising unemployment, which in turn pushed many low-income citizens into banditry. Food scarcity, in particular, is a serious issue for Skyrim, since most of its land is frozen and infertile. That makes the province heavily dependent on Cyrodiil for food supplies. When the rebellion broke out against the Empire, trade between Cyrodiil and Skyrim was disrupted, worsening the crisis. The only real way to replace the missing food stock was to increase local agricultural production, but the dangers of the war made that nearly impossible. Even Jarl Balgruuf mentions at his war table that their food supplies are running low, showing how severe the logistical crisis has become, and a Breton merchant in Whiterun even admits that because of supply shortages, he's been forced to raise prices on his goods. This is why farmers in Skyrim are incredibly valuable in such times. In regions like Whiterun and Markarth, we can find citizens still working their lands and producing food. Those areas are more fertile, which explains the higher concentration of farms there. And for safety reasons, most of these farms are located right outside the city walls. An interesting case is found near Windhelm, where even in the freezing conditions, people are still tilling the soil. I believe this is one of Ulfric's strategies to keep his Stormcloak army fed. What's really intriguing, though, is that one of the farmers outside Windhelm, the supposed capital of Nord nationalism, is actually a Dunmer. Considering how often the Stormcloaks are accused of racism, that's something worth thinking about. Of course, while the war negatively affects most urban merchants, a few actually benefit from it. A great example is the War Maiden's blacksmith shop in Whiterun, run by Adrienne Evanici and her husband Ulfberth Warbear. Their situation shows how small businesses can sometimes thrive, even amid the chaos of war. Adrienne Evanici is one of the few business owners who managed to adapt successfully to the wartime economy. She openly states, "We've got enough steel to fight a war," clearly acknowledging that her main source of income comes from supplying weapons and armor to the armies. For her, the war has created a stable flow of demand and a reliable income. It's also worth noting that her biggest client is the Imperial Legion. Even though Whiterun seems to be ruled by a neutral Jarl, we know that the city provides weapons and logistical support to the Legion behind the scenes. Her husband Ulfberth, however, gives us a glimpse into how fragile Skyrim's logistics have become. If Adrienne were to die, whether by accident, a vampire attack, or any random misfortune, Ulfberth can't continue smithing on his own. In that case, he's forced to buy materials from Khajiit caravans instead of official suppliers, since these caravans are often barred from entering the cities. And yet, these Khajiit merchants play a vital role in Skyrim's wartime economy. Despite the dangers, they continue traveling across the province, keeping trade routes alive in whatever way they can. This situation shows just how dependent local businesses have become on risky, informal trade networks. With imperial and local supply chains stretched thin or completely broken, merchants like Ulfberth have no choice but to rely on marginalized traders operating outside official systems. When you travel Skyrim's roads yourself, you can easily see the consequences. Most merchants are escorted by hired guards or mercenaries, and bandit ambushes are almost routine. I'm sure you've also been ambushed by thieves or assassins on the road more than once. So, while some local traders profit from the war economy, others are left struggling against the chaos, danger, and uncertainty it brings. And before we wrap up this part, it's worth taking a closer look at those Khajiit caravans I mentioned earlier, and the unique situation of the Khajiit people in Skyrim. The province hosts a noticeable number of Khajiit, many of whom, unlike their kin in elsewhere, do not support the Aldmeri Dominion. Most of them came to Skyrim seeking a new life after the devastation of the Great War. There's a long-standing prejudice against the Khajiit, one that paints them all as thieves. Throughout Tamriel, people tend to see them as untrustworthy, and in Skyrim, that stereotype is so strong that most cities won't even let them through the gates. Still, these traveling caravans play a crucial role in keeping Skyrim's logistics alive, making their situation a bit of a paradox. But the Civil War has made life dangerous even for the Khajiit, who are known for their stealth, agility, and ability to see clearly in the dark. With bandit activity on the rise, caravans have become prime targets for robbery and violence. And when cities come under attack, trade often comes to a complete halt, since caravans can't safely operate. The Khajiit have chosen neutrality in this war. They don't side with anyone, but that neutrality hasn't protected them from the indirect consequences of the conflict. Ulfric's Stormcloak, for instance, doesn't assign men to protect Khajiit caravans, since his main concern is the safety of his own people, the Nords. And with the Imperial Legion's control weakening across Skyrim, there's really no one left to help them. Except for us, the Dragonborn. Protecting these caravans is no easy task, though. Even the quests tied to their trade routes show just how dangerous Skyrim's supply lines have become during the Civil War. The Civil War has endangered not only the livelihoods of the people living in Skyrim, but also their personal freedoms and psychological well-being. It has even, at times, taken people's loved ones from them. Sometimes it's someone's mother, sometimes someone's son, or someone's spouse. Now, let's examine these effects of the war step by step. The most severe form of the personal cost of war is the practice of conscription. Both sides have the authority, through the local jarls, to forcibly recruit from the existing guards or civilian workforce. We see a good example of this in a dialogue between Jarl Elisif of Solitude and her steward Bolgir. Bolgair expresses his concern to Elisif that General Tullius is constantly sending guards to the front and that this is leaving the city vulnerable. Similarly, Skald, the Jarl of Dawnstar, a city under Stormcloak control, makes a speech indicating that the rebels are committing more rebels to their army, which is risking the city's security. The fact that this power of conscription is seen as a governing right by both sides shows that the ordinary citizens' participation in the war is more of an obligation than a choice. And of course, the most negative indicator of this can be seen in the orphaned children on the streets of Skyrim. In almost every city in Skyrim, we come across an orphaned child. Some have sent their mother and father off to war and never heard from them again, while others were caught in the middle of a civil war skirmish and lost their family. We see this sad sight in the girl selling flowers in Windhelm, and in the children running around the streets of Whiterun. It's even possible to adopt children in the game as the Dragonborn. The issue of orphaned children is one of the most painful aspects of the Skyrim Civil War, and it's something that constantly hits us in the face. These conscription practices parallel those seen in real-world civil wars. During the American Civil War, both the Union and Confederate governments enacted the first national conscription laws to fill their military reserves, serving as an example of the heavy burdens governments place on the civilian population when conflicts intensify. The Civil War has also fueled the historical divisions between established families. In fact, I should point out that the Skyrim Civil War represents more than just a simple collapse of the social system. It means the construction of a new, polarized social system that deliberately weakens and destroys existing bonds and mediating institutions. You might be confused, but I can explain it simply. Fundamental social ties, like family, kinship, and community bonds, are targeted by military leaders to solidify their own loyalties, and thus the conflict spreads from the top down. Riverwood and Whiterun emerge as key indicators of this systemic breakdown. In Whiterun, the very first time you walk the streets, you immediately feel the tension of the long-standing rivalry between the Greymane and Battleborn families. These two Nord clans, both claiming descent from Ysgramor's 500 companions, have spent centuries in both friendship and competition. However, the Civil War has transformed this personal and economic rivalry into an irreversible political enmity. The ban on Talos, the war's most fundamental trigger, provided an ideological groundwork for families to legitimize their ancient grudges along a political front. The Greymanes support the Stormcloaks, while the Battleborn support the Imperial Legion. This opposing alignment has deepened their hostility. The conflict allows old disputes to be resolved or intensified under the guise of ideological loyalty. The Greymane family's support for the Stormcloaks is largely based on anti-Thalmor sentiment and a personal sense of grievance against the Empire. Furthermore, the Civil War has also taken a son from this family, Thorald. He was captured by the Thalmor and taken to Northwatch Keep. The Greymanes believe the Empire covered up this abduction or didn't make sufficient effort to save their son's life. Naturally, the Greymanes' political choice is built upon this deep sense of emotional betrayal and a quest for justice. Through Thorald's kidnapping, we see the direct impact of the Civil War on local families. The Battleborn family's loyalty stems from the belief that the Empire is the only long-term defense line against the Aldmeri Dominion, and from the pragmatism of maintaining commercial stability. The family views the Stormcloaks movement as an authoritarian force that disrupts the order and trade security provided by the Empire. As a tragic consequence of this enmity, the Romeo and Juliet-style forbidden relationship between Jon Battleborn and Ulfina Greymane shows how the family's political divide is imposed upon the new generation, and how even personal bonds of love are crushed under the weight of political hostility. In fact, this impossible love story proves to us how the Civil War can seep into even the simplest of lives. In Riverwood, we see another dramatic story. This example best shows how even the smallest settlements cannot escape the forced political divisions of the Civil War. Ideological separation is no longer just experienced on the battlefronts, but also between next-door neighbors. Critical families who provide the community's basic sustenance and have historically cooperated have now been split apart by the Civil War. Recall the moment at the start of the Skyrim game after Alduin's attack in Helgen, when we had to choose between a Stormcloak rebel or an Imperial soldier. Whichever one we chose determined which family we would go to for help in Riverwood. Let's now talk about Alvor and Gerdur, who create these two different outcomes for the two different choices. Alvor, the blacksmith, and Gerdur, the owner of the lumber mill, two of Riverwood's most important residents, find themselves on opposite sides of the conflict. Gerdur is a Stormcloak supporter and backs her brother, Ralof. Ralof was the Stormcloak soldier we spoke to in the cart at the beginning of the game. Alvor, who is the uncle of Hadvar, the Imperial soldier who asked our name during the execution, supports the Empire. It would be somewhat lazy to view this split as a simple ideological difference. It is more a division that fragments the village's fundamental economic and social integrity. Even though they both live in Riverwood, which is technically a neutral territory under Whiterun's rule by Balgruuf, the game's story presents them as supporters of opposing military factions from the very beginning, showing us the sociological effects of the Civil War. It's very difficult to speak of any unity among the people in Skyrim cities anymore. Of course, despite the social fragility in a small village, these people continue to do their jobs and carry on with their lives. However, we always feel the tension. I think this weakening of communal bonds constitutes one of the greatest harms the Civil War has inflicted upon the people of Skyrim. Finally, we can look at Markarth, one of the places where the Civil War's impact on the social structure is most evident. Here, the Civil War has caused a resurgence of political corruption. The city's established family, the Silverbloods, use the political instability and conflict created by the region's native Bretons, the Forsworn, who claim the city as their own, as an opportunity to eliminate their personal rivals and opponents. We see that Thonar Silverblood makes a secret deal with the imprisoned Forsworn leader Madanach, spares his life, and in return uses Forsworn militants as assassins to eliminate the Silverbloods' political rivals. This situation is a prime example of how the Silverblood family exploits the power vacuum created by internal conflict to their advantage. Thonar has used this vacuum to mask actions that would normally carry heavy criminal penalties as internal security or political cleansing activities. This proves that the Civil War not only takes place on the battlefields but also provides an environment that allows the legitimization of deep-seated corruption within the city. As you can see, we can encounter the effects of the Civil War in almost every city in Skyrim, but it's certain that we will mostly face the negative impacts of this conflict. I'd like to congratulate the creators of the Elder Scrolls Skyrim in this regard. They truly thought through how a civil war could affect a region down to the finest detail and presented it to us. As we often see in our own world, one of the greatest damages caused by war is the erosion of societal trust and the perception of stability. In Skyrim, even after the war ends, the fact that many civilian NPCs' dialogues don't change and they still talk as if the war is ongoing, I think this reflects, beyond a mere game mechanics flaw, the psychological inertia of society. The end of a major internal conflict isn't immediately reflected in daily life. The war in the minds of the people is kept alive not only by military clashes, but also by ongoing propaganda and political tensions. The war ending doesn't immediately usher in a period of peace. Furthermore, the outcome of the Civil War in Skyrim is left somewhat open-ended. No matter who wins, re-establishing order in Skyrim will require a much longer time, because the looming threat of the enemy, the Thalmor danger, is growing day by day. Non-Nord races living in Skyrim face various forms of pressure and discrimination amidst the rising Nord nationalism and the chaos brought by the war. We can find the clearest examples of this directly in Windhelm, the main center of the Stormcloak Rebellion. This issue is, in fact, the most criticized aspect of Ulfric and the Stormcloak cause. I won't go over it again in detail since I've already talked extensively about the presence of the Khajiit in Skyrim and their contributions to the economy. However, we can say that Khajiit cannot freely enter and leave some Skyrim cities, not just Windhelm. The most direct effect of the Civil War on the Khajiit is that it has left trade routes to bandits. This has significantly increased the risk of logistical movement. Ulfric Stormcloak, the leader of the rebellion, does not concern himself with the problems of the Khajiit caravans, and does not send his soldiers to support them. But if these merchants were Nords, they would probably be treated differently. Unfortunately, the nationalism heightened by the Civil War can make life very difficult for non-Nord races in Skyrim. Another minority is the Dunmer. The Dunmer, who fled the eruption of Red Mountain in Vardenfell and the Argonian invasion from the south, were granted a settlement in Windhelm by the High King of the time. Later, we can say that this place, which came to be known as the Grey Quarter, rapidly turned into a ghetto and an area of segregation resulting from racist policies. Don't think this was an official law, though. The Dunmer refugees are essentially trapped in the Grey Quarter because they are generally poor, are prevented from owning property elsewhere, and because moving under war conditions is too risky. Even local merchants like Revan Sadri live in fear of the Stormcloak supporting Nords. One of the main reasons the Dunmer draw backlash from Stormcloak supporting Nords seems to be that they remain neutral in the Civil War instead of taking a pro-Nord stance. The Dunmer defend themselves against this criticism by saying, "This is not our war. but I don't quite agree with that. After all, the Nords opened their doors to you and hosted you, right? Since the Dunmer are now citizens of Skyrim, neutrality doesn't seem like a very ethical option. Anyway, let's move on to the Argonians. We probably wouldn't be wrong to say that the Argonians are treated even worse than the Dunmer in Windhelm. In Windhelm, the city where Nord nationalism is most extreme, the Argonians are ordered to stay on the freezing docks outside the city gates. The fact that they are forced to do the hardest labor for low wages, despite their biological unsuitability for the cold, shows systematic exploitation and their own helplessness. Of course, we should mention that the Argonian situation has a historical development. In addition to the increased Nord racism fueled by the Civil War, they also have a tense relationship with the Dunmer, who historically enslaved them. In the dialogues of some Argonians, you can see this deep-seated hatred born from despair and injustice. As a result, it's true that Argonians are more inclined to support the Empire rather than the Stormcloaks. In their view, the Empire at least promises a more inclusive and non-racist governance. So, as you can understand, life in Skyrim is hard for everyone, whether you're a Nord, a Dunmer, or an Argonian. If you're an Altmer, then you risk being accused of being a Thalmor spy. You can encounter such suspicions against Altmer merchants in Windhelm. We experience the reflection of all these situations in our own world as well. The situations of the Argonians and Dunmer in particular bear strong similarities to post-colonial ethnic tensions and the forced migrations and marginalization of minorities seen after conflicts like the Balkan Wars. In an environment of rising nationalism, the rights of groups perceived as the other are quickly violated, and even oppressed groups can form a hierarchy of discrimination among themselves. It probably goes without saying that the ideology and actions of the Thalmor are inspired by 20th century totalitarian regimes, particularly Nazi Germany. The Thalmor's advocacy for racial supremacy, their suppression of a specific religious group, namely those who worship Talos, and their annexation of Valenwood bear striking similarities to the Nazis' concept of the Third Reich and the annexation of Austria. Naturally, it wouldn't be wrong to view the citizens of Tamriel who are kidnapped, interrogated in dungeons, and tortured as analogous to citizens crushed under Nazi persecution. Especially when we consider how marginal groups were targeted by the Nazis, the persecution faced by the Argonians or those who worship Talos fits into a clear framework. Looking at it from a broad perspective, we can see that the Skyrim Civil War is a conflict that operates in a morally very gray area. The Empire, while taking a pragmatic stance against the threat of the Aldmeri Dominion, has lost its own spiritual legitimacy. The Stormcloaks, while fighting in the name of freedom and faith, have jeopardized the moral high ground of their cause through actions like racism and murder. However, the ultimate price of this conflict is paid not by the ideological leaders or military generals, but by the common people. As is the case in every war, farmers, merchants, and tradespeople have had to face increased banditry, the collapse of trade routes, food shortages, and the threat of conscription. The war has created a mechanism of anarchy and economic collapse that fuels its own continuation. Children have lost their mothers and fathers, and some have lost their spouses. Furthermore, for non-Nord races, the burden of the war has increased exponentially. The Dunmer and Argonians in Windhelm are systematically marginalized by Nord nationalism, while also being ignored by the Empire, which has lost its authority. The unfortunate truth is that the end of the war is unlikely to solve these ethnic and economic problems. On the contrary, it will leave behind a legacy of distrust and discrimination in Skyrim's social fabric that will last for years to come. In many of my videos, I've stated that the most sensible idea, in my opinion, is for an independent Skyrim to form an alliance with Hammerfell, High Rock, and Cyrodiil. Naturally, this implies that I support the Stormcloaks. However, even I am certain that despite a Stormcloak victory, Skyrim's recovery will require many long years. Therefore, regardless of who wins, I have no doubt that the Civil War will leave a legacy of anarchy and economic crisis for future generations. Of course, I hope we can learn about the state of Skyrim and the Civil War in the 6th game. We've reached the end of another video. I hope the Civil War series has been satisfying so far. I'm eagerly awaiting your thoughts on the impact of the Civil War on ordinary people. If you know of any similar stories that I haven't covered, please remember to share them with me. Who knows, maybe one day I'll make videos about them too. If you'd like to support me, you can like this video and subscribe to my channel. See you in the next video.